What is going on? You guys are listening to Yuppies and Harpoons. I am a co-host, Joe Moeller, and to my right is Jacob Glenzer. Jacob.
Yeah, good morning. How you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. So we are entering a new stage of, I guess, the Trump indictment saga this morning. I was planning to talk about political theory, but the news cycle just,
Well, why
always
not a
takes
fourth
precedent, I
indictment
guess, over.
for
What's
the
that?
former sitting president? The fourth indictment for the former sitting president takes
Yeah,
little precedence over that, I guess.
yeah. No, it's a pretty big story. I think that it looks like the Georgia prosecutor from Fulton County
Hmm.
um, indicted Trump and a bunch of other Trump allies, I guess, and Trump officials. Mark
Right.
Meadows included Rudy Giuliani on interfering and seeking to overturn the Georgia election results. And this was coming from the Wall Street Journal,
Hmm.
and they were mentioning, I think it was like they called it racketeering. That it was the racketeering charges carries a sentence of 5 to 20 years, while a conspiracy conviction can can result in a minimum sentence of 1 year in prison, while with a variable maximum sentence. And so
Okay.
I've never. I've actually never heard the word racketeering used in a legal setting, and so maybe that's just because I'm, a novice. But it was kind of weird hearing that word racketeering. Like, what? What does that
Well,
mean?
and I think part of that too is really trying to. It's not just Trump, but there's a number of others. I think 19 people total involved in this indictment. So going into Mark Meadows and Sidney Powell, two people who very loyal to Trump through 2020 and January 6th. The big lie, if you will. So really bringing down not just Trump, but all of his supporters and his close allies there. So this one's really hitting Trump personally and strategically as well.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting case because there's a lot of, I guess, what you call bad behavior that everyone would agree that Trump engaged in. I think that's actually a very bipartisan statement that Trump behaved very, very inappropriately
Mm.
throughout the January 6th, saga, and before that. Going to a Secretary of State, regardless of if you can prove that his mental state actually was that he believed that the election really legitimately was in Joe Biden's favor. Like
Mhm.
even if Trump really, even if you can't prove that he didn't have a mental state, a mens rea, the behavior that he engaged in by trying to pressure Brad Raffensperger to find votes is just, it's absurd, and it's not absurd. It's bad. It's immoral. But
Mhm.
it's not necessarily legally prosecutable. You have to prove, and I think this is where the Georgia case is going to be interesting to see how it plays out. It's the burden is on the prosecution to show that Donald Trump, one, knew that the election was not stolen, and knew that Joe Biden legitimately won, specifically the election in the state of Georgia,
Right.
and that while in that mental state, so he can change his mind, but you have to prove that at the time he was pressuring Brad Raffensperger to find, illegally find, fraudulent votes, that at that time he thought that Joe Biden had legitimately won the election in Georgia, and
Right.
that any time you have a mens rea component that's kind of iffy, the legal standard is very, very hard to reach. It's very hard.
Mhm. Yeah, and so this is now what, number four. So the first one was the Stormy Daniels payment. So that was a state prosecution. Then the next two are both federal courts. So you have the Mar-a-Lago classified documents and then the efforts to overturn 2020 election. So that one's being handled down in D.C. So this then is another state prosecution too. So how that, what Georgia laws are on the books then as well to make a case for this against Trump will be pretty interesting to see how that plays out.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well, Oh, and just so our viewers know, we're actually recording this in the morning. We're normally some evening guys, but circumstances change. Before me today is a really nasty looking protein shake. This is my advertisement for my amazing protein shake. What's in this is you have one banana, you have a dab of milk, and then you have oats, and then you have one egg, and then you have one scoop of protein powder, and a handful of berries and peanut butter. And so it is absolutely delicious. You're free to use this recipe. I'm not gonna if you sell it online, I won't come after you. But it's phenomenal.
Is that
What are you drinking, Jacob?
I got myself some a double shot espresso, iced. So pretty straightforward, just to get the blood flowing in the morning. But and then I also have, as a backup, you never know, some kombucha.
Oh, where'd you get that?
Yeah, this is from Lidl, so grocery store.
LIDDLES.
LIDL, Lidl.
Yeah,
So
I've been there.
yeah, this is like an orange flavor. They have this brand Remedy has a number of flavors that all are really great. Enjoy drinking them for
It's
sure.
from California.
It's probably is. I definitely can trust something like this from California.
Yeah.
No, it's actually from Australia. So that's
better. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, sorry. I always we're going to try and make a tradition of discussing what we're drinking. I'm not sure this is something that people will want to replicate or not, but if they do, craft kombucha is huge up in Vermont, and that's right. It's about an hour drive away from me. So I love me some kombucha when I get the opportunity. But yeah. So about this indictment, I'm not sure. I'm more watching from afar, especially with like the state cases.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what they're going to be able to come up with in terms of evidence to be able to say that to prove Trump's mental state. I think that the two to watch are actually the federal ones because one, I think the Florida case, they have Trump on the law. We'll talk about that probably later in a different episode, but I think they have him dead to rights. But the problem in Florida is that for the prosecution is the jury pool. So the jury pool selection, if you sample a bunch of people from Florida, it's very, very likely you're going to have somebody who doesn't give a damn about the law and just is like, this is political prosecution, and you need a unanimous jury. And so the jury pool selection is going to be much more in Trump's favor in Florida than it would be in a place like D.C. And so, which is where this overturning the election, January 6th case, that's also, I think, by, what's the guy? I totally just blanked on his name, the lead prosecutor.
The judge in that one, or?
No, the
judge is
the prosecutor. Special prosecutor.
For the DC.
Is it Ryan? Or Jack Smith?
Yeah, I believe Jack Smith. Trying to think. But yeah.
But
definitely the DC one, there's a lot more. The judge has been very strict on January 6th trials up to this point. So we know she's made it very clear that she's not going to take this lightly, and then on top of it, the jury selection, which is why you see Trump's attorneys trying to force this out to Virginia or someplace a little bit more favorable for a jury selection in Trump's favor.
Right. Yeah, because D.C. is one of the worst places. And so that's what makes this kind of interesting and unpredictable, because you have the best case in like what we call the worst venue.
Right.
And then we have, I would say, a lackluster case with the D.C. case, one that I think they're going to have a really tough time legitimately proving a mens rea. But in a venue that is
overthrow the election.
Yeah.
And do you think part of that is just that he wasn't successful? Joe Biden still took office January 20th, and there was a transfer of power there. How much do you think that plays into this case?
Specifically, like the fact that it's the Biden administration.
Just the fact that Trump's efforts weren't successful to overturn the election. If he was intentionally doing it, it wasn't successful, and so how much does that play into this case here in DC?
Well, I think if he had been successful, they wouldn't. He'd be the head of his own Justice Department, and so
it doesn't matter. Yeah.
I don't think it really. Yeah, I don't think it would. I don't think his own Justice Department would be going after him. And so I don't have that much confidence in the independence of the Justice Department to think that someone like Donald Trump, if they overturn the election, would then be prosecuted.
Right.
So, but yeah, no, I think it's an interesting. It's certainly an interesting current event to watch,
especially with the lead up to primaries and then, of course, 2024 presidential election too. So,
yeah,
a lot to keep the headlines rolling. I feel like in the next 15 months here.
Certainly, yeah, and I think when it comes to the primary, we've been watching this evolution of what exactly do Republican primary voters want, and there's a lot of different spins out there for, or takes that people have, but I think a more interesting question, and kind of diving into what I had sketched out before this huge headline dropped, which is basically a discussion of what it means to be, far right, what it means to be far left. I think that's a very interesting question in today's age, because it's just fundamentally changed. At least in my view, because for a long time, the American political system had this really unique political axis, and what I mean by that is you have a right wing and you have a left wing. And you can read any historian; they'll talk to you about right wing populists, right wing authoritarians, left wing populists, left wing authoritarians. But in the U.S., we've had something fundamentally different for a long time, which is on the right, like the philosophy of government heavily embeds itself into what we mean by right and left. What is your role of government? It goes the whole way back to Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Alexander Hamilton believed that, he believed in a strong federal government. And part of that was because he was a man of the city. He was a man of industry. And so, you have a lot of people living in a compact area, and it was just easier for the government to be able to provide services in a small concentrated area. And he, as a man of loving the city and loving industry, believed in a strong federal government, and a strong involved government in society. Thomas Jefferson was someone who really believed in the lifestyle of agriculture. He believed that freedom from tyranny existed out in the woods, out in the cabins, out in the farms and the ranches, and was very, very suspicious of the animal of economics and compact cities, and back in his day they didn't have buses and trains, but yeah, and so you had this debate between Hamilton and Jefferson, and really that has been in existence in American politics, I would say, for about almost 250 years. This existed before the founding.
Before the Constitution. Fights taking place and conversations being had. Because Jefferson, famously almost doesn't buy the Louisiana Purchase, which was, one of the best land deals. I want to talk about being real estate Mongol. He nailed it with that purchase, but
Yeah.
debated whether or not he had the authority as a government to do that, and then Alexander Hamilton on the flip side then creates the national bank, and you really see a push into larger government that way. Um, so yeah, very interesting contrasting, and it comes down to just balance of power. Um, you still see that today with it seems like every 4 to 8 years we switch what parties in the White House. And that's kind of our way as a nation to continue that trend.
Yeah, it's really interesting because back in, well, I would say growing up, like my grandpa, if you just talk to my grandpa, classic conservative, limited government, hates, almost thinks that the U.S. Constitution was too liberal. He likes the Articles of Confederation, keeping things at bay. Um,
State
he
rights.
yeah, right. Um, he always told me that his favorite president was Calvin Coolidge. And when you listen to like common Republicans that are considered very conservative, the pattern has been for them to say, "Yeah, I really liked Calvin Coolidge," or you know, or Ronald Reagan. Like George Will was a very big, I believe, was a very pro Calvin Coolidge guy and writer, and Calvin Coolidge basically didn't believe that the government really had a right to hardly do anything,
Mm-hmm.
and then his contrast back in the early 1900s were presidents like Woodrow Wilson and FDR. And so
Right.
you've had this ideological distinction, and then even later you have people like Lyndon Johnson, and who then years later is after two following presidents, in comes to office Ronald Reagan, you know, a paleo conservative, someone who believes in the limited role of government, someone who adheres to Milton Friedman's view of liberal free market economics. Um, and
And kind of like a
yeah,
reaction to from FDR until Reagan. Really, it is a growth of the government, increasing amount of government intervention, and Reagan. Some part of Reagan's success was a reaction against that, against some of the policies that have been pushed forward by FDR and all the way through Carter.
yeah, yeah, certainly, yeah. It's it's interesting because that's what we've had here in the U.S. And I would say that distinction even existed up through like the Bush and Obama era, where you had Romney, Ryan, running against Obama, Biden. This classic of we want to cut taxes, we don't like Obamacare, versus we believe in that it's the government's role to provide access to affordable health care, and that the rich need to pay their fair share, and we need to hold the banks accountable for their actions in 2008 versus the more you just see this dynamic of the right being the party that's interested, or the think tank that's interested in limited government, and the left being one that's much more supportive of a more involved government in the lives
Right.
of citizens. But that is not the case. That's a long way to say that is not the case, and that's not the way it's been around the world. If you look at Europe, I mean, if you look anywhere pretty much other than the U.S. is really maybe the UK. You could argue the UK has a similar layout, kind of, to the U.S. But with Thatcherism and whatnot. But but around the world, you have a much different dynamic of what it means to be right and what it means to be left, and you see this in the news. And yeah, my uncle, you see this. I'll get into what my uncle said here in a bit, but the news headlines constantly say things like, right wing leader, you know, threatens this country's democracy, and it always seems to be some right winger. It's never you never hear about the left wing authoritarians anymore, and I think part of that has to do with the mainstream media's affiliation with the left, but also there is something different about being right and being left. around the world.
Right.
And there's an interesting book on this, written by a guy named Jonathan Haidt, called The Righteous Mind. And in the book, he basically argues that to be someone who is conservative is to be someone who is reactionary in nature, or and sees, I have it basically, like, conservatism seeks to slow the rate of change to what's compatible within existing institutions. And someone on the left, or liberalism, is the desire to change something because the injustice of the present circumstances warrant risking the stability of existing institutions.
Mm-hmm.
The conservative critique of that isn't that it's not that they're not interested in pursuing justice, it's that the potential cost of sacrificing the stability of our institutions will bring about greater injustice than resolving the present injustice that those institutions currently impress upon the public.
Right.
So that, and I think that has slowly worked its way into the American system as we've become a global superpower. I think what it means to be right and be left, the global pendulum, I guess, if you will, the global political spectrum has slowly worked its way in to American life, into American politics, and I think that begins to explain how the Republican Party especially went from the party of Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan to the party of Donald Trump, where
Mm-hmm.
you had a large contingency of voters who were just used to voting Republican. And yes, they kind of agreed with that. Let's cut taxes. Let's cut regulations. I don't want government in my life, I guess, attitude, to somebody comes along with brass knuckle rhetoric and, is reacting to the cultural shifts that are happening. And those voters instantly latch onto him like that.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone's like, what happened?
Well, and I think it's extremely important to point out, you look at the primary, 2016 Republican primary, the core of Donald Trump's voting base, it's always fascinating. Many of the folks in that original primary support that he had been on welfare before. And these are folks that you wouldn't necessarily, some of their actions would not necessarily be aligned with the Republican Party, but they vote for the Republican Party because they see Trump as a change maker, as someone who will reach out and actually recognize some of the folks in the Rust Belt in Ohio, these states that had been left behind. Although Trump is very much an elite in his own way, he represented people that felt like they were harmed by the elite and wanted that to be resolved. And I think you see a huge rise in the primary through this population of people who were just left behind and felt they weren't connected with anyone in the country. So there's a lot of the folks that drive the base of Trump.
Yeah. Especially originally.
And it's less on policies and more on rhetoric, which is why I think it's difficult to pinpoint exactly what the Republican and what the Democrat platforms really represent at this point, because they're so different with the introduction of Trump in the mix.
What do you think Trump's done to the Democrat Party? Do you think he's shifted how the left wing, what the left wing means in the U.S.? Do you think he's changed that, or do you think the left wing is still in touch with like Obamaism?
Mm-hmm. I go back and forth on, did Trump change the Democrat Party kind of as a response to Trump, or was it on that direction? Trump is such a polar opposite. It kind of showed where the Democrat Party was, and less as a driving change. So I think really Trump didn't change the Democrat Party. I do think kind of showed what the Democrat Party priorities are. And also, I think the Democrat Party does an incredible job at PR. They know how to push things through. And, I think they learned a lot under Obama with some of the stimulus packages that didn't have great support with the public. They really have gotten down on how to sell what they want to do and the policies they do. I think a lot of that they learned under Obama of how do we raise support for the new CHIPS Act or whatever bill
Right.
is relevant at that point, which wasn't always successful under Obama. So they've done a really good job at reining that in and being able to push the agenda forward, good or bad. Just I think they've done a good job at accomplishing their mission.
Yeah, it's
From that
interesting. Like
standpoint.
you don't really hear much about. Oh no, it seems like a lot of Democratic initiatives commonly are the most are very popular, and that's always something that someone who leans conservative, I've always kind of found mildly frustrating. Is that anytime you hear about, like, if you, I think something like what 37% of voters or low 40% of voters supported the tax cuts, which brought, the Trump tax cuts, which brought just a massive amount of economic investment to the U.S. and overseas money. And it's just like, 55% of voters oppose it. Like, what? But
Right.
if you look at something like the CARES Act, everyone was just completely in support of it. The polling on that was incredible, and so
Mhm.
um, I think that Republicans have a really tough time with messaging. I think that's
And
actually
I
beginning to
think
change, but
that's a great way because they doubled the standard income with standard deduction. I'm sorry, they doubled the standard deduction of the Trump tax cut to what is it, 12,000 and some change per person. So if you're married,
20,
24,000.
yeah, yeah,
Standard deduction, which is just, I mean, before it wasn't, it was half of that, a quarter of that, and that impacts that bottom tier directly of
right.
tax. People making less than 400,000 or more a year, that they really benefited from that. But like you
And
said,
the child tax
there's not a
credit
lot of
too. Um,
child tax credit. Yeah,
yeah, I mean,
it wasn't just a tax cuts for the rich and the poor or middle class didn't get anything. The poor middle class had some pretty substantial benefits from this,
right.
direct benefits, not these, not in theory benefits like some kind of trickle down. It was your standard deductions more than doubled now.
Right.
So
Right.
yeah, it's interesting to see how that's something Republicans really need to hone in, and I think have taken it for granted a little bit, or just not had to focus on knowing how to sell what they're doing. I think that's part of the reason why they lost in 2020 so bad across the board, and then again the following year Republicans lost because of messaging. There's a lot of good things they had done, and there's almost no coverage of those things. It was a lot of the negative feedback that put people on their heels. That led to messaging, and therefore lost the election for most Republicans in states they should have won.
Yeah, the losses were pretty heavy in 2022. But I think that this is also like you're seeing this change in what it means to be right wing in the Republican Party, where we went from this kind of this paleo conservative pitch where our thinkers were people like George Will and Jonah Goldberg and whatnot, and it transitioned into this more of this populist, we need this anti-free trade, very this heavy emphasis on immigration, which
Mm-hmm.
from a demographic standpoint I don't think makes much sense in the U.S. But this hyper focus on immigration, and and really not being involved around the world militarily. So more recently we've seen like pools of people who do not want to offer any sort of aid to Ukraine. And so to me,
like Mike Pence was kind of stuck on that question when asked his thoughts on Ukraine a few weeks ago by Tucker Carlson. It was kind of like a litmus test of, do you support the Ukraine? If so, are you really Republican? Very anti-interventionist.
I thought that was one of the most dishonest videos I'd ever seen. The idea that Mike Pence, actually, the very premise of that question that he was asked is that you're willing to provide lots of money towards Ukraine, but we have all these problems. We have homeless people in the streets. We have a crumbling infrastructure. I'm like, hold on a second, wait. So is Tucker Carlson saying that he supports like government spending on like city infrastructure, or like what's he? That's not something that that's not something that the federal government should be doing. If you're a traditional conservative, that's something that the local cities should be doing through their own tax revenues. And it's not like local city revenue's been being used to fund Ukraine. It's been federal money. And so I don't know. I think that was just the setup of that was, it just played right into Tucker's hands. Like, we have an invasion of our southern border, as if we can't fix our southern border and help out Ukraine. Like,
we don't have the largest GDP in the world, and although we are spending high levels, it's like a few $1 billion is a line item. It's pretty minor when you're talking trillions of dollars as well. And like you said, like, so does that mean Mike Pence should support entitlement programs and like increase those? Because that doesn't sound good either from his base.
Well, that's the thing, though, is that Trump doesn't support cutting Social Security, right? He's not going to touch Social Security. He added $8 trillion to the debt while he was president, and so we're at I would say an inflection point of what it means to be conservative in today's age. And I think that the Republican Party has a lot of candidates that are running around Trump, obviously all are behind Trump in the polls, but I think there's a lot of traditional Republicans that are trying to like present themselves as like this populist guy who, agrees with Trump on, a lot of the populist rhetoric, but really once you take the mask off, they're just going to be a traditional Republican. Right. And I think part of the reason that they're not catching any sort of ground is that that's really not what Republican voters want. There's a large contingency that Donald Trump exposed to not be that interested in limited government philosophy,
Right.
And so,
well, and that, I think it goes back to as well, the U.S. in part has been so successful because our strategy is to be kind of the world police. We don't want to admit it, but let's be honest, how many countries in the world do not have a military and just rely solely on the U.S. military for protection?
Right.
It goes back to one of the Navy admirals back in, I think, the 1800s, who said, if you control the ocean, you control the world. And that's kind of been one of the dominating philosophies of the U.S. and of the U.S. being on as the world power. So not being involved in Ukraine, what does that give up in terms of credibility for the U.S.? There's no good solution, and if anyone running right now was elected tomorrow, how different would they handle Ukraine once they actually are faced the decision themselves?
Yeah.
So
Ukraine's I think is a very interesting debate on the right, because like to me, we're the country that went around and tried to build up I guess an ally spreadsheet against the Soviet Union by encouraging countries to become westernized and democratic. And are we going to let a country in Europe have its own sovereignty violated? I constantly hear, conservatives say, that NATO encroached on Russia or whatever, and it's like, what? Let's say even if that's true, that doesn't like I can't say that someone else provoked me, and therefore that justifies me beating the living shit out of somebody else. Like,
Right.
that doesn't make any, and so the morality of it, it's like, well, we knew that they were already tempted to punch, Jimmy in the face, and then you started telling them that they didn't have the guts to punch Jimmy in the face, and then you did it, so I guess it's
And they did
okay.
it.
Like, it doesn't. It's a terrible thing that Ukraine was invaded. Its sovereignty was violated, and so, as a yes or no, is what Russia did a good thing? Now, I guess whether or not you support giving aid to Ukraine and helping Ukraine, that's kind of a separate question. But I think if the U.S. has an interest in the world order or the norms of sovereign borders being protected, it needs to supply aid to Ukraine. It does.
Right.
It's because we want to say the exact same thing with Taiwan, and so I don't see that as something that's really that questionable, especially when we can basically aid the Ukrainian military and deplete the Russian military at the same time.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's not like we haven't been in Ukraine. We have military bases, military presence in Ukraine. We do joint exercises with Ukraine. It's been regularly, it's well known that we have relationships with Ukraine. So this coming out of nowhere, of suddenly we don't do anything with Ukraine, Ukraine's on their own, just is not true and doesn't support the narrative as well. Not to mention, what's the alternative? We just pull out of Ukraine completely and Russia takes over one more country, and then what's after that?
Yeah. Well, there's also this idea that NATO is a somehow Russia. Like, the other problem I have with this, the idea that Russia was provoked, is that NATO. What is it going to attack Russia? Is it going to conduct a land invasion? Are you going to see NATO tanks, flying through, these limited access points that Russia craves, and then just invading Moscow? Like, who thinks that's going to happen? Maybe if you're, a Russian and you listen to Russian state media all the time, you think that NATO is going to invade, but that's something that's been propagated by the Russian media state empire, and so I don't think that that's something that's realistically ever going to happen.
Right. And I think part of the issue right now is so many states are, 1 foot in, 1 foot out. You look at China, you can even look at like Saudi Arabia, where they're going and making deals directly with Russia, with China, having these economic reliance on one another, but all while not really supporting Russia at the same time directly. So I feel like the U.S. and NATO, really NATO as a whole, is looking at it saying, if we were to do a land invasion into Russia and try to, show who's boss, what other countries are going to come behind? Is China coming in? Is Saudi Arabia? Which side are they going to pick? India, which side are they going to pick? I think there's all these countries involved that don't know how they would get involved. And I think until, maybe China makes it much more clear of, hey, we're going to be behind Russia 100%, or no, we're not going to be behind Russia at all. Then I think you're just going to kind of see this stand by until it's just going to be a dogfight until someone finally gives up, it seems.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, no, I totally agree. What do you think of the fact that someone like Putin is considered right wing? Do you agree with that description?
No, not really. I don't think it's fair to compare I mean, he's a dictator, and so he doesn't have right or left wing overall. I think you could look at some of his policies and say, yeah, that's more right versus left. But to say like blanketly, no, I don't think that's fair because he's not operating the same system as the U.S. So by putting like American labels on something outside the American system, it doesn't really. I think all it does is make the label weak in the long run because now we don't really know what does right versus left actually mean. What about you?
Well, I think that I was giving this some thought the other day, and I think that because the new thing relatively on the world stage is liberal democracy and how that slowly evolved into like a global order, reactions to, I guess, westernization are reactionary. Like that in nature. You see this in India, you see it in Brazil, you see it in China to some extent, although China's a little bit of a different situation. And you see it in Russia. And they are reacting and out of that reaction proposing new directions. And so attitudinally, I would say that someone like Vladimir Putin is right wing. But in terms of his policy, I can't make any sort of helpful prediction about what Vladimir supports or what Vladimir Putin is going to do based on a certain ideology other than machoism. And, you know, machoism, it's not really a place you can put on the political spectrum. My uncle had a funny line once. He said, where do you put jackass on a political spectrum? You know, and I've always liked this. It's like you have these truly awful characters that, you know, come onto the scene, and everyone wants to throw them to the right or to the left. And I was doing this thought experiment the other day with the Nazis, where you walk through what the Nazis supported, what they did, what their campaign rhetoric was like, and you know, when you do the totality of the circumstances, which is the term we use in law school, when you take the totality of the circumstances, it's not clear at all what they were. Like you have, for instance, anti-Semitism. It's like, well, I hear this always. You know, people think like characters like Richard Spencer is a far right guy. Well, if you look at, you know, and because he's a neo-Nazi, and it's like, well, he voted for Joe Biden. He actually came out and endorsed Joe Biden, and Joe Biden, you know, correctly threw out his endorsement. But someone like Richard Spencer supports universal health care. You know, and if you start looking through like the Nazi platform, they are, from an economic standpoint, anything but something that falls into like the traditional American, you know, limited government access. But when it comes to, when it comes to anti-Semitism, that's not something that exists solely on the right. I mean, actually, in fact, right. the right wing in the United States is really fascinating because it has anti-Semitism. People like Marjorie Taylor Greene and, you know, that caucus that talks about you know, Jewish space lasers. But we also have the most pro-Israel politicians in the Republican Party, people who basically seek the endorsement of Benjamin Netanyahu as a campaign, you know, sticker to put and market around to people, to Republicans around the country. And so you have this weird dynamic. And so clearly that's kind of odd. And then you have people on the left who clearly have anti-Semitic,
just look at the Squad.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
Extremely anti-Semitic comments, constantly speaking out against Israel, but also just against Jews as a people group.
Right, as a people group. Yeah.
You know, I can understand in a way speaking out against Israel as a nation, but you know, speaking out against people, I mean,
Well,
how do you get
there's a distinction, and I've actually always appreciated this distinction from Ben Shapiro. He says you can there's a difference between criticizing the state of Israel and criticizing Jews.
correct?
And people tend to convolute those a little bit. You know, it's like, hey, you know, that judicial reform bill sucks. You are an anti-Semite. You hate Jews. You know,
Right.
the reason that you don't support the judicial reform bill is because you don't think that, you know, the Jews are human. It's like, no, it's because I believe in democratic checks and balances. But
good policy, or and I think it can get very tricky when we don't correct on bad policy, because then it's just rampant, and then it becomes this like ship that you don't want to be a part of, associated at all, because it's gone so far and wasn't corrected along the way that now the base can't get behind.
right.
But yeah, and I think another thing you mentioned, Ben Shapiro, he always mentions, you know, he's the most targeted individual by hate groups in the nation for a handful of years. I don't know if he currently holds that podium, but I know he's usually up there in terms of hate groups and
Death threats and stuff.
you know, obviously leads the largest conservative host or whatever the tagline he has, but you know, very conservative and very hated by.
Well, you know, that whiny voice is just so threatening. It's just,
yeah.
It's just, you hear that and you're like, oh my God, I'm scared for my life.
Miracles do come true, because for a man like with his voice to make it in radio is beyond me.
Yeah. But to get back to that,
anyways,
to the original, or not the original, but like the point I guess I was driving at with the Nazis was the only thing I can really say that makes the Nazis like or describes the Nazis in any sort of like conservative rhetoric is their attitude. It's like we want to restore the Reich, you know, we want to bring it back, and so from that perspective, you know, I get it. It's reactionary. It's that, you know, we got royally screwed over after World War I, and we're in an economic, you know, depression, and this was caused by, you know, other leaders, and we used to be a proud people, and that sort of, you know, let's go back mentality is a callback to some previous form of structure that I think that I would say leans conservative. But if someone is going to call back to the, you know, if you're like a Russian today and you're talking about wanting to bring back the old Soviet Union, well, that might be a conservative impulse, but there's nothing ideologically consistent. It's just a callback to whatever was, you know, a certain amount of time ago. Another example of this would be during the American Revolution, right? You know, the conservative psyche would lend itself to being a Tory, you know, as opposed to being a revolutionary. And so, you know, the people that were more conservative are more conservatively minded today and are more in lockstep with trusting institutions, I think would be more Tory minded and more likely to have been Tories back in the days of the revolution. Whereas people who didn't give a damn and don't tend to give damns about, you know, existing institutions because they see injustice, they would have been the revolutionaries. And I'm not sure how I'm not sure how correlated that is along party lines.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how correlated the attitudes are. But I think if that's going to be your hermeneutic, then it has no ideological weight to it whatsoever. And so calling somebody like Vladimir Putin right wing has no affiliation to me considering myself center right in the U.S.
Right.
But
and I think that goes back to the whole, like, Putin's outside of our classification of what that is, right versus left. Putin does what he wants. He doesn't have to answer to anyone but Putin.
Right.
So if he feels something is beneficial or is needed to be done, it doesn't have to go past the litmus of some party test so he can get reelected. He has election in the bag. He's good to go there. Now he can do what he wants. Where I think in the U.S. you do have a little bit more of that. This person's left or this person's right, because every 4 years or 2 years or whatever the election cycle is for that position, is they're going to have to pass that litmus test again of saying, oh, I'm still your right wing guy, or I'm still your left wing guy, to the base. Where in places like China, that they don't have to worry about that because their election's taken care of. They don't have election cycle to handle.
Yeah,
So-
that's for sure. Well, I think we're coming up on. Were you?
Yeah.
What were you gonna say?
Well, and I think that's part of, not to bring any credit to Putin or to Xi Jinping in China. Dictatorships are efficient and at a governing style. They can get things done. They can move quickly because they are the ones making the shots. Where in the U.S. you have a little bit longer. You have those checks and balances, so things don't happen immediately. So I think that's another level of why the whole Ukraine situation's fascinating, because you have Putin making the calls for Russia, and then you have this, I don't even know what you want to call it, but the rest of the world basically trying to come together and have one opinion on where to land on the Ukraine crisis. So I think that's just going to lead to further impasse.
Right.
But that's just my last thoughts on that.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think we're approaching the close to the hour mark. We have a couple more minutes, but I think we've covered our bases here today. So this is episode number 2, and so hopefully we can keep this up. And if you guys are enjoying the Yuppies and Harpoons podcast, don't hesitate to subscribe. We're just like 2 young bucks that are looking to get into this, and we really appreciate you listening.
Subscribe,
What's that? Like
comment.
and subscribe, comment.
Rate us. What else do you do with podcasts? Share it.
Preferably don't leave a rating if it's not good.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
Just next channel. But yeah, no.
If you share it, Joe will personally come to your house and bake you a cake. So if you share with your personal friends,
you don't want me to do that.
Joe will come to everyone's house.
I can't cook.
And,
I can't do it. Yeah, I'm terrible.
But anyways,
anyway, all right. Hey, well, good seeing you, and we will catch you later for podcast 3 that will be released next week on Wednesday. All right, see ya.
Yuppies and Podcast, or Yuppies and Harpoon. What am I? Do I know the name of this thing yet? No.
All right. Hey, Hadil, we're gonna need to cut that out on the final. You just need to cut that out. All right, we will see you next.
We just edit out to just Joe, and then we can stay as a pod.
Keep cutting. All right, hold on. So what I'm going to say is we will see you next Wednesday on Yuppies and Harpoons. All right, 3. And we will see you next Wednesday for our next episode 3, next week. Oh, God. Oh, my God. I botched that. Hold on. Okay. Oh, my word. All right.
You're about to get fired.
All right, 3. All right, and we are going to have an episode up this Wednesday and also next Wednesday. We're going to keep it on the Wednesdays. We want to keep it at the peak of the week. All right, Jacob, I'll see you next week.
Signing off.
All right, signing off.